The bell rings, signaling the beginning of another class. Students shuffle in, most of them pale faces filled with excitement for the lesson ahead. Their voices mix with laughter, but there's a clear undercurrent of tension in the room. At the front of the classroom, Mr. Hutton, early 30s, stands with a textbook in his hand. He adjusts his glasses, offering a welcoming smile to the class. Mr. Hutton: "All right, everyone, let's settle in. We've got an interesting lecture today on the American Civil Rights Movement." The camera pans to the back of the room, where we see Jalen, 15, black, with short, neatly combed hair. His posture is straight, but his expression reveals the internal weight of being one of the few black students in a prestigious, predominantly white high school. His eyes are alert, scanning the room. He pulls his hoodie tighter around his shoulders. Next to him is Lena, a white girl with a kind smile, and Carlos, Hispanic, who offers a friendly nod. They both notice Jalen's discomfort but don't say anything. They've been friends for a while but sometimes still don't fully understand the depth of what Jalen experiences. Mr. Hutton, today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal periods in U.S. history. Who can tell me what was the main goal of the Civil Rights Movement? Lena raises her hand and Mr. Hutton immediately calls on her. Lena: To fight segregation and get equal rights for African Americans. Mr. Hutton: Exactly. Great answer. Pauses, scanning the room. Anyone else want to add to that? Jalen hesitates, then raises his hand. Mr. Hutton's eyes flicker toward him but linger for a moment too long. He doesn't seem eager to call on Jalen but does so anyway. Mr. Hutton: Jalen, what do you think? Jalen stands tall, his voice steady. Jalen, the Civil Rights Movement wasn't just about getting equal rights on paper. It was about fighting against a system that refused to see black people as equals, fighting for freedom in every part of life, from voting to education to employment. It's about power and dignity. Mr. Hutton half smiles. Interesting take. But I think it's important to remember that the movement was more about, he starts to interrupt, the specific legal changes. And those legalities are what brought about the change we see today. Jalen's face tightens, a mix of frustration and disappointment washing over him. He tries to keep calm, but there's an undeniable sting. Jalen, speaking a bit louder: But those legal changes were just a start. It's not about laws. It's about how people change their mindset, how society stops seeing black people as less than. Mr. Hutton's face briefly flickers with discomfort. He adjusts his posture, clearing his throat. Mr. Hutton: Well, it's good to have multiple perspectives, Jalen. But I still think focusing on the legal aspects is key to understanding the movement. The room goes silent for a moment and there's an odd tension in the air. Mr. Hutton quickly moves on to another student, trying to brush off the moment, but it lingers in the space between him and Jalen. Suddenly, Jalen's phone buzzes. He pulls it from his pocket, a brief distraction. It's a message from his dad. The name Marcus pops up on the screen. Jalen smiles softly to himself, proud of his father's influence and role in the community. Mr. Hutton: Jalen, could you tell us what you're looking at? Jalen looks up, startled. Jalen: Oh, it's just a text from my dad. Mr. Hutton, clearly unsettled: Your dad? What's his name? Jalen Marcus. Mr. Hutton's face pales slightly, and he visibly shifts, blinking rapidly. His hands tremble for a second before he grabs the textbook again, flipping through it as if searching for something to distract himself. Mr. Hutton: Right. Well, clears throat. Marcus: Yes. Nervous chuckle. Well, let's move on then, shall we? Jalen's eyes narrow slightly. There was something about Mr. Hutton's reaction, something unsettling. He doesn't know what, but it feels off. Lena and Carlos exchange glances. They notice the brief tension but say nothing, letting the moment pass. All right, back to the Civil Rights Movement. Let's focus on the leaders who really shaped the course of history. How did the leadership of figures like Dr. King, the Corey? Scene continues, but the seed of doubt in Jalen's mind has been planted. His father's name, Marcus, has somehow shaken Mr. Hutton in a way that makes no sense. Jalen wants answers. The sun has set, casting a warm glow through the windows. Jalen sits on the couch, his phone still in hand. He's scrolling through social media, but his mind is elsewhere, on the strange encounter in class. His father, Marcus, enters the room, from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He's a strong, commanding presence known in the community for his activism and leadership. There's a softness in his eyes when he looks at Jalen, a quiet pride. Marcus, raising an eyebrow. "Everything all right, son? You seem a bit off." Jalen looks up, trying to act normal. "Yeah, just school stuff." Marcus, stern but gentle. "School stuff? You don't look like a just school stuff kind of kid. What's going on?" Jalen sighs deeply, setting the phone down. He runs his hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. "Jalen, it's Mr. Hutton. We were talking about the civil rights movement today and I..." Pauses. "I don't know, Dad. It didn't feel right. Like, he kept brushing me off, like my thoughts didn't matter." Marcus sits down beside Jalen, looks him in the eye. "What exactly happened?" Jalen recounts the details of the class, the dismissive tone, the way Mr. Hutton cut him off, and the strange reaction when he mentioned his father's name. Jalen, "And then when I said your name, Marcus, he just froze, like it scared him." "I don't get it, Dad. Why would he do that?" Marcus takes a moment to process, then speaks calmly. "It's not about you, Jalen. It's about what my name represents. It's not just a name to some people. It's a symbol of something much bigger. When I was younger, I was out there in the streets fighting for justice. I spoke up against systems that tried to silence black voices. And that kind of activism? It makes some people uncomfortable." Jalen looks down, processing his father's words. He leans back, his thoughts racing. "Jalen. But he's a teacher, Dad. Isn't he supposed to be teaching us to think, to speak up, to challenge what's wrong? I don't understand how he could..." Pauses. "Why is it so hard for people to just listen?" Marcus takes a deep breath. "The truth is, Jalen, not everyone is ready to listen. Not everyone is comfortable with the truth. Some people are so used to seeing things one way, through a lens that benefits them, that when you challenge, that it's like you're shaking their world apart. And instead of listening, they push back. They don't want to hear it. They'll call you angry or confrontational. But what they're really doing is trying to silence you." Jalen's brow furrows, feeling a deep sense of frustration. Jalen, slowly. "So, what do I do? Just let it go?" Marcus, smiling softly. "No, son. You don't let it go. You stand your ground. You speak your truth, even when they try to shut you down. Your voice, your story, matters. Never let anyone make you feel like it doesn't." Jalen looks up at his father, his resolve slowly building. His father's words ignite something inside him, a sense of purpose, even though the fear of being rejected still lingers. "Jalen, so it's not just about them not agreeing with me, it's about me standing strong in who I am, right?" Marcus, exactly. It's about your identity, your history, your dignity. They can't take that away from you unless you let them. Jalen nods, taking a deep breath as if absorbing the weight of his father's advice. There's a long pause before he speaks again. Jalen, quietly, "I won't let them silence me." Marcus places a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "That's my boy." The next class begins and Jalen walks in, his posture straighter, his mind focused. He's been stewing over the incident, but today he feels different. Today he's not going to let Mr. Hutton brush him off. Mr. Hutton stands at the front lecturing the class about the significance of major figures in the civil rights movement. As he speaks, Jalen's eyes narrow. He's waiting for the moment, and it comes. Mr. Hutton, gesturing to the board. And of course, people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks are often seen as the faces of the movement. Their sacrifices were immense, and they were part of the legal progress. Jalen raises his hand, his voice calm but firm. Jalen, Dr. King, and Rosa Parks were important, yes. But the movement was much more than just those people. It was about the everyday folks who risked their lives, like the Freedom Riders, or the activists who fought for jobs and decent housing too. Mr. Hutton blinks, his smile fading slightly. He gestures for Jalen to continue, but clearly doesn't seem to want to engage with the full depth of what Jalen is saying. Mr. Hutton, that's one perspective, Jalen. But remember, we're focusing on the legal and political changes right now. Jalen doesn't let it slide this time. He leans forward, his voice steady but growing in intensity. Jalen, it's not just about politics or law. It's about people. It's about what people are willing to fight for even when the law tells them they don't matter. My dad, Marcus, he taught me that. He wasn't just fighting for laws, he was fighting for us to be seen, for us to have dignity. A hush falls over the room. Mr. Hutton's face tightens, and he shifts uncomfortably, but Jalen's voice doesn't waver. Jalen, eyes locked on Mr. Hutton. You can try to gloss over it, but you can't erase the fact that this fight was and still is about people fighting for their humanity. For a moment, the classroom is completely still. Mr. Hutton opens his mouth to respond, but nothing comes out. The other students look between Jalen and their teacher, sensing the tension. After class, Jalen is called into the principal's office. The door clicks shut behind him, and he sits down in front of Mrs. Taylor, the principal, a middle-aged woman with a neutral expression. Mr. Hutton is sitting on the other side of the room, fidgeting slightly. Mrs. Taylor, softly. Jalen, we need to talk about what happened in history class today. Jalen holds his ground, his voice steady despite the awkwardness. Jalen, I wasn't disrespectful, I was speaking the truth. Mr. Hutton, defensive. He was being difficult, Mrs. Taylor. The lesson was about the legal changes, but he kept pushing his own agenda. Mrs. Taylor, interrupting. I understand, Mr. Hutton. But I've also heard Jalen's side of the story. We need to have a conversation about how we're handling these sensitive topics in the classroom. Jalen sits stiffly in the office, glancing between Mrs. Taylor and Mr. Hutton. Mrs. Taylor leans back in her chair, studying Jalen's face with a measured look. Mrs. Taylor, Jalen, I can see you're passionate about what you're saying, but we need to keep discussions respectful. Jalen, quietly but firmly, I was being respectful. I wasn't yelling or cursing. I just told the truth. And the truth is that sometimes teachers don't want to hear it. Mr. Hutton, raising his voice slightly. It's not about truth, it's about staying on topic. He disrupted the class, Mrs. Taylor. Mrs. Taylor, holding up a hand to silence him. Let's take a step back here. Jalen, I'm going to be honest with you. I can't ignore what you're saying. Your point about the civil rights movement being about more than laws, it's valid. But how you express that matters. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. Jalen meets her gaze, a mix of frustration and determination in his eyes. Jalen, I get it. You want me to be calm, right? But sometimes, it feels like the only way people listen is if you're quiet. And I can't be quiet anymore. My dad's been fighting for justice his whole life. He taught me to speak up. Mrs. Taylor nods, understanding the weight of his words. Mrs. Taylor, I hear you, Jalen, and I'll make sure we address the way we approach sensitive topics in the classroom from here on out. But you need to understand sometimes your tone can make things harder, even when you're right. It's a balance. Jalen looks down, nodding slowly. Jalen, softly. I just want people to listen, to really listen. Mrs. Taylor, softly. I understand. And maybe it's time for some of us to listen more too. Inanti. Jalen's living room. Evening. That evening, Jalen arrives home with a mixed feeling of relief and uncertainty. He walks into the living room where his father is sitting in his favorite armchair reading a book. Jalen stands in the doorway for a moment, collecting his thoughts. Marcus, looking up, seeing Jalen. How'd it go? Jalen, sitting down beside him. They called me to the principal's office. Mr. Hutton complained about me disrupting the class. But Mrs. Taylor. She understood. She said she'd make sure the teachers approach these topics better. Marcus nods approvingly. You didn't back down, though. That's important. Jalen. Yeah, but I don't know. I still feel like I'm not being heard. Like people just want me to be quiet so they don't have to confront the truth. Marcus, gripping Jalen's shoulder gently. That's part of it, son. But remember, just because they don't want to hear it doesn't mean it's not worth saying. What you're doing, speaking up, it's not easy, and it's going to take time. But the world needs people like you who won't stay quiet. Jalen nods slowly. I know, I want to make sure I'm doing it right. Marcus, smirking. There's no right way to speak your truth, Jalen. You just have to be yourself. But you've got something that a lot of people don't. Your voice. Don't be afraid to use it. Jalen sits back, feeling a sense of reassurance wash over him. There's still work to be done, but he's starting to feel empowered in a way he hadn't before. He's not just speaking for himself anymore. He's speaking for the countless voices that have been silenced before him. The classroom is calm, the lesson well underway. Mr. Hutton is discussing the aftermath of the civil rights movement, but this time he's chosen to focus on the broader societal impact. Jalen watches him closely, waiting for a moment to speak. Finally, Mr. Hutton asks a question to the class. Mr. Hutton. So, class, how do you think the civil rights movement has influenced our society today? Jalen raises his hand. Mr. Hutton hesitates, for a moment, clearly aware of their previous interactions, but gestures for him to speak. Jalen, standing up. I think the movement showed us that change is possible, but it's not easy. It's not just about laws being passed. It's about changing how people see each other. It's about recognizing that we all deserve respect, no matter who we are or where we come from. My dad, he always told me that the fight isn't over, that we've still got work to do. The class falls quiet. Jalen's words hang in the air, and for the first time, Mr. Hutton doesn't interrupt. There's no defensiveness, no tension, just a simple acknowledgement of the truth. Mr. Hutton, after a pause. That's a very powerful point, Jalen. Thank you for sharing that. The class continues, but the dynamic has shifted. The other students seem more engaged now, and even Mr. Hutton seems to be listening with a little more openness. That night, Jalen sits at the dinner table with his family. His mother, Tanisha, is serving food, and his younger sister, Layla, is chatting excitedly about school. Jalen glances at his father, who meets his eyes with a knowing look. Jalen, softly. I think I'm starting to get it. Marcus, smiling. Get what, Jalen? How important it is to speak up, and how powerful our voices are, even if it feels like no one's listening. Marcus, placing a hand on his shoulder. That's the lesson, son. Keep speaking no matter what. The bell rings and students flood the hallway heading to their next classes. Jalen walks with Lena and Carlos, his two closest friends. They're walking side by side, but there's a slight distance between them. Lena, who's always been the outspoken one, notices Jalen's quiet demeanor. Lena, noticing his silence. Hey, you okay? You've been kind of off today. Jalen shrugs. Yeah, just thinking about everything. Carlos, sincerely. You've been handling a lot lately, man. I don't know how you're doing it. Jalen, slowly. I don't know either. But I feel like I can't let up now. I've got to keep pushing, even when it's hard. Lena, softly. We've got your back, Jalen. All of us. Don't forget that. Jalen smiles faintly, but the weight of everything still lingers in his heart. For a moment, the hallway noise fades away and it's just him with his thoughts. Later that week, the school holds an assembly on racial equity. The students file in, taking their seats as Mrs. Taylor steps up to the microphone. She introduces the topic for the day. Mrs. Taylor, earnestly. We're here today to discuss racial equity, a topic that is important for all of us. Our goal is to listen, learn, and understand the diverse perspectives of those around us. The students listen, attentively, but there's an underlying tension in the air. Jalen's eyes scan the room. Mr. Hutton is sitting off to the side, his arms folded, a disapproving expression on his face. Mrs. Taylor, today, we'll start by discussing the history of systemic racism and how it's shaped our current society. We'll be hearing from a few students, including Jalen, who will share his thoughts on how this issue impacts his life. Jalen? The room goes silent as all eyes turn to Jalen. He stands, trying to steady his nerves. His heartbeat pounds in his chest. Lena and Carlos look at him, offering silent support. Jalen clears his throat, the weight of the room pressing down on him. Jalen, voice steady, but full of emotion. We've been taught that racism is something of the past, but it's not. It's still here. It's in how people look at us, how we're treated, how we're expected to act. People like me, we've learned that we have to work harder, speak louder just to be seen. Pauses. But it's not just about me, or just about black people. It's about all of us. If we don't face this head on, if we don't challenge it, every day we're part of the problem. Jalen pauses, the silence in the room thickening as he continues. Jalen, voice growing stronger. My dad, Marcus, he taught me that we can't wait for change to come. We have to fight for it. He's fought for it his whole life, and I can't stay quiet anymore. Not when I see the same things happening to other people, to my friends, to my community. Mr. Hutton shifts uncomfortably in his seat, but Jalen doesn't. Look at him. He focuses on the students in the room, the faces staring back at him with varying degrees of discomfort, but also a few with understanding. Jalen, softly but with intensity. So I'm going to keep speaking, I'm going to keep fighting, I don't care if it makes you uncomfortable, because this is the truth. Mrs. Taylor, stepping forward quietly. Thank you, Jalen. That took a lot of courage. The room is still for a moment, the weight of Jalen's words lingering in the air. The students are processing, shifting in their seats, perhaps reflecting on the deeper truth Jalen has just spoken. Even Mr. Hutton, who had been tense, now looks slightly chastened, a look of quiet reflection in his eyes. Later that night, Jalen sits at his desk doing his homework. His mind is still reeling from the assembly. There's a knock on the door before it opens slightly. His father, Marcus, steps into the room, a proud but thoughtful expression on his face. Marcus, smiling. You did good today, son. Jalen, looking up, a small smile. It felt right. I think they're finally hearing me. Marcus, sitting down, beside him. That's because you're speaking the truth, Jalen. And when you speak the truth, it's impossible to ignore. Jalen pauses, looking at his father. But what if they still don't listen? What if they just don't care? Marcus sighs deeply. There will always be people who don't want to hear it. But that's when your voice matters the most. You keep using it, and eventually change will come, even if it's small at first. Jalen nods, feeling the weight of his father's words. Jalen, softly, I won't stop. I can't. Marcus, and you don't have to. You've already started something, Jalen. You've made a difference just by being brave enough to speak, and that's how change happens. The next day, Jalen walks through the hallway feeling a different energy around him. He notices a group of students talking quietly, their eyes darting toward him. As he passes, one of them, a white student, nods at him. White student, small smile. Hey, Jalen, that speech you gave, it made me think. Jalen pauses, surprised but grateful for the acknowledgement. Jalen, softly. Thanks. I appreciate that. As Jalen walks down the hallway, he notices more students watching him, not with judgment, but with respect. He feels a flicker of hope, a sign that things are starting to shift. It's not perfect, but it's progress. Later that evening, Marcus and Jalen sit on the couch together. Marcus watches the news, but Jalen is lost in thought, reflecting on everything that's happened. Marcus. You know, son, the fight isn't over. It's never going to be. But I'm proud of you. You're carrying a legacy that's bigger than both of us. Jalen, sincerely, I'm just getting started. Jalen steps into the classroom, his heart still pounding from the recent confrontation. His classmates are whispering, casting curious glances toward him. Mr. Hutton stands at the front, trying to compose himself, but there's an air of tension in the room. Jalen takes his seat, trying to block out the nervous energy in the air. The bell rings, signaling the start of class, but for once it feels different. Mr. Hutton clears his throat, his voice slightly shaky. Mr. Hutton, quietly. All right, class. Let's settle down. He pauses, glancing nervously at Jalen before focusing on the rest of the students. Mr. Hutton, today we'll continue with the discussion on systemic racism. Jalen, you had some interesting points yesterday. Why don't we... Jalen cuts him off, his voice steady and firm. Jalen, Mr. Hutton, I don't need you to repeat your lectures. I've heard enough. A moment of silence falls over the room as students glance at each other, unsure of how to react. Mr. Hutton's face turns red with frustration. Mr. Hutton, raising his voice. Jalen, we don't need this attitude. You're disrupting class. Jalen, quiet but firm. No, what's disrupting class is pretending that we're not dealing with the real issues here. That's the problem with people like you. Mr. Hutton looks taken aback. The classroom feels like it's closing in around them. Jalen's chest tightens, but his resolve grows stronger. Jalen, I'm done pretending everything's fine. You've got a problem with what I said, with the truth, and I'm not going to stand here and let you silence me just because you're uncomfortable with it. A deep breath. Jalen's hands tremble, but he doesn't look away. Jalen, my dad's name is Marcus, and I'm proud of that. He's been fighting for change his entire life. You may not like what he stands for, but you can't erase that. You can't erase me. The classroom goes quiet. Even Mr. Hutton is speechless, his face pale, hands trembling. But this time it's not because of fear, it's because he knows Jalen is right. Mr. Hutton, voice wavering. I didn't mean to upset you, Jalen, but this isn't the place for that kind of talk. Jalen stands tall, facing him. His voice, though shaky, has the power of 1,000 truths behind it. Jalen, soft but resolute. It's exactly the place for it. We can't ignore the world around us just because it makes you uncomfortable. It's about time we all started talking about it. There's a long silence. Mr. Hutton looks down at his feet, struggling for words. Jalen looks around the room, seeing the stunned faces of his classmates. A few of them exchange glances, their expressions shifting from discomfort to understanding. Jalen's best friend Carlos whispers from across the room. Carlos, quietly, but with conviction. Jalen's right. We have to talk about it. Lena, who has been quiet up until now, nods in agreement. Lena, I didn't get it before, but now I do. It's not just about school. It's about everything. Jalen's heart swells with a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a powerful sense of validation. Jalen, softly. Thanks, Carlos. Lena. Mr. Hutton's voice finally breaks the silence. Mr. Hutton. I see. I don't fully understand it, but I'll try to do better, Jalen. I know I've made mistakes. Jalen, firmly. And don't just try, do better, that's all anyone can ask for. Mr. Hutton's shoulders slump, and for the first time, he seems to understand the weight of his own actions. Mr. Hutton. I will. I promise. Jalen nods, satisfied with the moment of accountability. Jalen. Good. Now, let's talk about the truth, and this time don't try to hide it. The bell rings, signaling the end of class. As students file out, Jalen stays behind for a moment, his eyes meeting Mr. Hutton's one last time. He sees something different there, a small glimmer of respect perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement of the change that has just begun. As Jalen steps out into the hallway, his friends gather around him. They walk side by side, their steps lighter than before. Lena. That was amazing, Jalen. You're changing things. Carlos. Yeah, man. You've got the whole class thinking. Now, even Mr. Hutton. Jalen, smiling. Maybe, but change starts with all of us. The three of them walk through the school, a newfound sense of unity between them. Jalen knows this is just the beginning, but it feels like a victory. The following days are a blur of emotions for Jalen. While the tension in the classroom seems to have settled, the weight of his actions hangs heavy. He feels different now, stronger, but also more isolated. The stares from his peers have shifted, and the hallway conversations that once seemed innocent now feel like whispers behind his back. At home, Marcus is sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee when Jalen enters. The warmth of the kitchen feels like a comfort, a reminder of the unspoken strength that Marcus has always been. Marcus looks up at Jalen, noticing the exhaustion in his son's eyes. Marcus, you okay, son? Jalen nods. I think so. I had to speak up, Dad. In class, it got intense. Marcus sets his coffee cup down, concern etched across his face. Marcus, intense? How intense? Jalen, Mr. Hutton, he didn't get it at first. He was uncomfortable, but I had to say something. I couldn't just let him keep pretending everything's fine. Marcus smiles softly, proud, but also pensive. Marcus, you did the right thing, Jalen, but I know it's not always easy. Speaking up, it takes a lot. I've seen it firsthand. Jalen sighs. Yeah, but it didn't feel like enough. I mean, I said what I had to, but things aren't going to just change because I spoke up, right? Marcus quietly. No, change doesn't happen overnight, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth fighting for. Every time you speak your truth, you make a difference, even if you can't see it right away. Jalen looks at his father, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Jalen, but what if no one listens? What if it doesn't matter? Marcus leans forward, his eyes locking with Jalen's. Marcus, trust me, son. It matters. It always matters. Your voice, your story. It's powerful. And you're not alone in this. People like us, we've been speaking out for years, even when it felt like no one was listening. But one day, someone will hear it. And then, maybe, it will be the start of something bigger. Jalen looks down, feeling the weight of his father's words. Jalen, thanks, Dad. I think I get it now. Marcus reaches out and places a hand on Jalen's shoulder. Marcus, you're doing the work. Just remember, it's not always about the loudest voice. It's about the truth you carry. Jalen nods, his confidence slowly rebuilding as he lets the words sink in. The next day at school, Jalen walks through the hallways with a new sense of purpose. He knows he's not alone anymore. Carlos and Lena have been by his side, and there's a change happening in the air. Though the whispers continue, there's also something else. A shift. In history class, Mr. Hutton stands at the front, trying his best to maintain composure, but the tension is palpable. Jalen walks in and takes his seat, ready for whatever comes next. Mr. Hutton starts the lesson, but this time, there's an air of discomfort around him. He glances over at Jalen occasionally, but his usual dismissiveness seems to have disappeared. Mr. Hutton. All right, class. Today we're going to continue our discussion on systemic oppression. Jalen, you had a lot to say about this last time. Care to share some of your thoughts? The room falls silent. Jalen's gaze shifts to his classmates, then back to Mr. Hutton. There's a moment of uncertainty, but he stands tall, his voice steady. Jalen, we're not just talking about history anymore. We're talking about real lives, real people. And if we're going to learn anything from the past, we need to understand how those systems are still hurting people today. Mr. Hutton nods slowly, his face unreadable. He's quiet for a moment as if considering Jalen's words. Mr. Hutton, go on. Jalen continues, his voice gaining strength with every word. Jalen, people like me, Black people, we're still living in the aftermath of that history. It's not just about the past. It's about how we're treated every single day. The microaggressions, the stereotypes, the assumptions. They might be invisible to some, but they're there. Lena and Carlos, sitting at their desks, share a look of solidarity. Lena, supportive. Jalen's right. It's not just something that happened back then. It's something that's happening right now. Carlos. Yeah, we see it, all the time. Jalen's voice breaks a little, but he doesn't back down. Jalen. I know it's uncomfortable, but we can't keep pretending it doesn't exist. We have to face it. And that means people like Mr. Hutton, people who have the power to make a difference, have to listen. Really listen. Mr. Hutton stands still, his hands clenched at his sides, a moment of silence passing between him and the class. Mr. Hutton, softly, but with sincerity. You're right. I've failed you, Jalen. I failed to listen. Jalen looks at him, his expression a mix of frustration and hope. Jalen, all I want is to be heard, to be seen for who I really am, not just the color of my skin. Mr. Hutton looks around the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of the other students. Mr. Hutton, I promise you all, I'll do better, I will listen, and I'll try harder to understand. The room is quiet, but there's a shift. Something has changed. It's not perfect and it's not enough, but it's a start. Later that day, Jalen walks through the hallways again, his head held high. He knows that what happened in history class isn't the end, it's just a step. But it feels like a victory. He's not backing down and neither are his friends. As he reaches his locker, Lena and Carlos catch up to him. Carlos, you really made him listen today. Lena, yeah, you did. I can't believe it. It feels like we're actually starting to get somewhere. Jalen, smiling. Maybe, but we've got a long way to go. I won't stop until the change happens. Carlos, grinning. We're with you all the way. Lena. Together we're unstoppable. Jalen nods, his heart swelling with gratitude. He knows the road ahead will be hard, but he's not walking it alone anymore. The following week, Jalen walks into the school with a feeling of uncertainty weighing on his shoulders. It's been days since his confrontation with Mr. Hutton in front of the whole class. He knows that the fallout will be inevitable, but he's also beginning to understand something deeper. This fight isn't just his anymore. It's a fight for everyone who's ever been silenced. His friends Lena and Carlos have been supportive, but he can feel the eyes of his peers on him. Some are curious, others judgmental. The quiet whispers follow him in the hallways, and every glance feels like a reminder of the battle he's chosen to face. In the principal's office, the atmosphere is tense. Mrs. Taylor, the principal, sits at her desk with Mr. Hutton across from her. The air feels thick with discomfort. Jalen, standing beside his father, can't shake the feeling that this meeting won't provide the kind of closure he hoped for. Mrs. Taylor looks at both men, her eyes shifting between them. Jalen, she says softly, her voice calm but firm. Please explain to me what happened in that classroom. Jalen swallows, trying to steady his nerves. He takes a deep breath, speaking with a measured tone, but there's an undeniable fire in his words. It was the constant dismissals. The way Mr. Hutton always overlooked my answers or questioned my contributions, Jalen says, his voice steady. And then, when I spoke about my father, he pauses, the words catching in his throat for just a moment. Mr. Hutton lost control. He told me I was making everything about race, but the truth is, everything in this country has to do with race, whether people want to face that fact or not. Mr. Hutton shifts uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between Jalen and Mrs. Taylor. He opens his mouth to speak, but his voice comes out shaky. I didn't... He stops himself, takes a breath, and tries again. I didn't mean to cause any harm. I was just trying to teach history, trying to make it relevant. I didn't realize my actions were being perceived as discriminatory. Jalen's father, Marcus, who has been quiet until now, speaks up. His voice is calm but carries a strength that commands attention. It's not just about perception. It's about the reality of living in a world where the histories and voices of Black people are often erased, silenced, or minimized. We don't just talk about race because we want to. We have to. It's our truth, and it's time people start listening. Mrs. Taylor nods slowly, absorbing the weight of Marcus's words. She turns back to Mr. Hutton, her tone no longer polite but firm. Mr. Hutton, you've made several missteps with Jalen. It's clear that there's a need for further training on how to handle sensitive subjects. And the way you reacted to Jalen's personal experiences, well, that was unacceptable. We will be addressing this formally. Mr. Hutton opens his mouth to argue, but the look Mrs. Taylor gives him silences him immediately. He looks down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I understand. I'll do better, he mutters under his breath, clearly defeated. Jalen stands, tall, a quiet sense of pride filling him. Even though he knows this won't be the end of his struggles, he feels a shift. His voice has been heard, and for the first time, he's taken control of his narrative. The days following the meeting pass in a blur. Jalen returns to his classes, but the dynamic in the school feels different. There's a subtle change in the air, a heightened awareness among his classmates. Some approach him, apologizing for their previous ignorance, while others, those who'd been silent in the background, remain distant. Lena and Carlos walk with him during lunch, their conversations now laced with deeper understanding. They talk about their own learning experiences, their growing desire to address the inequities they see around them. I never realized how much you've been carrying all this time, Jalen, Lena says, her voice sincere. We're with you. If you ever need anything, you've always been with me. Jalen replies, a small but genuine smile breaking through. But now I think more people are starting to listen. Carlos nods, his expression serious. We need to make sure we keep pushing. For everyone. We can't stop now. Jalen knows this is just the beginning. The battle isn't over, but something has shifted. His confidence has grown, and with the support of his friends and family, he knows he has the strength to keep pushing forward. That evening, Marcus and Jalen sit together in the living room. The air is calm, the weight of the day's events still settling in their hearts. Jalen looks over at his father, who's watching him with quiet pride. I'm proud of you, son, Marcus says, his voice warm. You stood your ground when it counted, and that's how change happens. It doesn't always come in big moments, but it starts with one person daring to speak the truth. Jalen nods, feeling the weight of his father's words sink. The weeks that follow are a mixture of quiet change and continued resistance. Jalen moves through his daily routines, each step carrying more weight than the one before. The school may not have fundamentally changed overnight, but Jalen feels the shift within himself. He holds his head higher, walks with a little more purpose, and speaks with a deeper conviction. And though the road ahead is still filled with obstacles, Jalen knows that he's not alone anymore. He continues to work closely with Lena and Carlos, and their friendship strengthens in unexpected ways. The more they discuss what they've learned and the more they push for change, the clearer it becomes to Jalen that this fight isn't something he can carry by himself. But it is a fight worth carrying. One day, as Jalen walks down the hall, he overhears a conversation between some of his classmates. A group of students, mostly those who had kept their distance or avoided eye contact, are discussing the recent racial equity discussions that have been happening more frequently in class. There's a shift, a murmur of recognition that has been slowly working its way into the fabric of their interactions. I didn't know it was like that for Jalen, one of the students says, the tone thoughtful, almost apologetic. I never realized how much he has to go through just to be seen as equal. I think we all need to pay attention more, another one chimes in. It's not just about race and history. It's about real lives, real struggles. Jalen's heart pounds in his chest as he overhears the conversation. A quiet sense of pride begins to swell inside him, though it's mixed with the understanding that this change will take time. The students aren't perfect, and the system isn't fixed. But something is happening. His voice is being heard. Later that week at a school assembly, a panel discussion on racial equity is scheduled. Jalen is asked to participate, alongside several other students from different grades. He stands at the front of the room, his hands slightly shaking, but his resolve stronger than ever. His words when he speaks are firm and clear. We've been taught history, But what we're not taught is how that history shapes us today. Jalen says into the microphone, his voice carrying across the room. We're not just talking about facts in a textbook, we're talking about people, real lives that are affected by the things we choose to ignore. He pauses, letting his words settle. Then looking out at the audience, at the students, the teachers, and the administrators, he speaks again. This isn't just my fight. This is our fight, and we need to listen to each other, support each other, and create a school where no one is left behind because of their race, their background, or their history. There's a moment of silence, a beat where everything hangs in the balance. Then slowly, a few students begin to clap, and the applause builds, filling the auditorium with a growing sense of solidarity. Jalen feels the warmth of that applause wash over him, but he knows it's not about the applause. It's about the changes they are beginning to make. As he walks off the stage, Lena and Carlos meet him with wide smiles. That was powerful, Jalen, Lena says, her voice filled with admiration. You really made them listen. Carlos nods. We've got a long way to go, but you've started something, man. You've made people think. Jalen smiles, but his mind is already turning to the future. There's still work to do. There are still many who don't understand, who don't see the impact of their actions. But Jalen knows he's no longer fighting in isolation. He's part of something bigger. That evening, Jalen and Marcus sit together on the porch watching the sunset. The warmth of the day lingers in the air, but a sense of quiet accomplishment surrounds them. You did well today, son, Marcus says, his voice calm but proud. You've got a lot of power in your words. You're making a difference. Jalen looks at his father, his expression thoughtful. It's not just about what I say, though, right? It's about what we all do next. Everyone needs to be a part of this. Marcus chuckles softly, nodding. Exactly. You're not alone in this, but you've got to keep speaking up even when it's hard. Keep pushing, keep questioning. Jalen nods, the weight of his father's words sinking in. For the first time, he feels like his place in this world is solid. He has a voice. He has purpose. And no matter what obstacles come his way, he won't back down. I will, Dad, Jalen says quietly. I'm just getting started. As the sun sinks below the horizon, Jalen's reflection in the window catches his eye. The face staring back at him is no longer uncertain, no longer unsure. There's a calm strength in his gaze now, a deep understanding of who he is and what he represents. He's not just fighting for himself anymore. He's fighting for everyone who's ever been told they don't matter, everyone who's been told their voice doesn't count. And in that fight, Jalen knows he'll never be silenced again.